actually, that the use for that is when I can't go into some detail about something or other, say you can read it. But I do. I was just told, Catherine, I woke up with the epiphany this morning, which I'm going to share. This really builds on the experience that we had with the conference. So when I was asked to make a presentation like Wednesday, I said, okay, because I really was on a high from that conference that we were doing on transformation of intractable conflicts. And I wanted to build on that. I've got 4 topics that I was going to do. One is on the building of a peace infrastructure, particularly in the United States, since the beginning of the Cold War, but more particularly afterwards. The insufficiency of that and the failures that we've experienced, and what needs to be done to build a stronger infrastructure to overcome the incredible challenges that exist, and then to invite you to figure out what you can do about it. So I want to leave time for that and think about that as we progress. First of all, between 1945 and 1989, there were many things that did help build peace in the world. The decolonization, which occurred sometimes bloodily, but sometimes not so, sometimes with the use of nonviolence. The UN was created and began to function fairly well. In the United States, there was great peace movement activity, resistance to the war in Vietnam, and in resistance to Reagan's policy to kind of intensify the Cold War in the early 1980s, and the development of peace studies and conflict resolution during this period in the 50s, the 60s, and it really took off in the 1970s after people being a little discouraged about creating a grand theory of conflict. People just began doing things in alternative dispute resolution and broader applications. And then, since the end of the Cold War, the UN was able to function more effectively. There were a great increase in peacekeeping operations, more intervention. There were a great decline in international wars because the proxy wars were over, and the conflict resolution field continued to expand, focusing more now on cleaning up the messes which the governments had created by some of their wars, and they weren't prepared to do that. They were prepared to fight wars, but there's no agency in any government to go and clean up the messes that they've left. And there was a lot of increase in peace movement, conflict resolution NGOs, and a lot of graduate students were getting jobs, going out, doing good. So it was glorious in a way. The Cold War ended without violence, except here and there a few, a little bit, but considering what could have happened, it's amazing. Apartheid ended, pretty amazing. Everybody was, now obviously those had been built up over time, and the waging of the Cold War by the United States and the Soviet Union actually was very creative in items like track 2 diplomacy, in using confidence building measures, with the growth of détente and cultural exchange. There were all kinds of very progressive constructive developments. Then, suddenly, but I discovered n-grams. I won't show you any n-grams, but n-grams are things that Google does. Google has digitized all books, and you can make in many different languages. So if you go to n-gram viewer, Google Books, you can put in any words you want in most any language. And the years that you want to look at their changes in frequency among all the words that exist in the language that you choose. And I showed some of them at the conference, but I didn't want to go through all of that. But you can do it at your leisure. It's a lot of fun. It's addictive. And conflict resolution goes up and up and up. It's really more and more references to it. Boom! They get a little downturn. This only goes up to 2008, but even earlier, 2003, 4, 5, it's going down. And that is true for many of the terms and words that are associated with that. Human rights go up pretty high. Don't dip. A lot of things dipping down. Because I think most people in America think, well, we're in endless war. We've been fighting a war, something or other, against terrorism or something or other, since 2000. 15 years ago, that the 9/11 struck. And even before that, we began to see that, the end of apartheid is great, but things ain't going so well in South Africa. One of the speakers that was at the conference who specialized in South Africa just was detailing how bad things have been in South Africa, and they're not getting better. Russia has become aggressive, antagonistic, authoritarian. Many other countries are becoming more authoritarian. So, whatever it was that we were doing wasn't enough. Now, I don't blame us people who are in the field of conflict resolution and collaboration are not responsible, but we certainly didn't save the day. Somehow or other, what was happening was done despite all the wisdom, all the ideas, all the knowledge that we had begun to acquire about how to do conflicts more constructively. So, what can we do? I think there are some paths towards a stronger and broader, more supportive environment. We just have to do some of what we've been doing more. I think this broadening that is going on to some extent with people learning about mediation, with kids in school, kids in neighborhoods, there is more dialogue work that's going on. And clearly, whatever there is, there needs to be a much greater activity. We're just going to start a community police dialogue program in Syracuse. And there was some work going towards that for a while. Obviously, there are other things that are going on here. Like the Near East Foundation, which is doing work particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. But What's, what was it that made it so easy to make an endless war out of a criminal act like an attack on by Al Qaeda? Now we could say, well, it's Bush's fault. He said that. He said it's a war, and he's a war president. And of course, that began to justify going to war in Iraq. But how could we have done that? I mean, in my chapter on the Bush years and realizing peace, I don't go into any great detail about how stupid and wrong and awful that war was, and its consequences are so dire, but how the hell could that have happened in this country? We have Congress, we have free press, we have peace movements, we have, experts, and a lot of people said, no, that's a bad idea. It wasn't as if, but I remember talking to people at the time, and they didn't defend it, but they said, it's going to happen. I said, yeah, I think it's going to happen, but it's bad. It's a bad idea. It's bad. It's going to happen. And so many people seem to just go along. That's the way it is. If you want to be at the table, then you're going to go along. And a lot of people just went along. But it also, I think, the way of thinking was such. I mean, people said, talked to a lot of people. That's common sense. It's human nature that people will fight and kill each other. Well, I always say, yeah, it's human nature, but human nature is expressed and dealt with in many different ways. Most people, most of the time, are not going around killing each other. It's a fairly rare phenomenon, actually, and it's getting rarer. Steven Pinker wrote a book on the better angels of our nature. He goes back to prehistorical sites and sees how many of the humans going back tens of thousands of years have crushed skulls. Look like they got smashed by something. Many deaths seem to be of men, women, kids, very early, relatively earlier age. And gradually that has become rarer and rarer. And even now in this terrible time that we're living, there are hardly any international wars, so we've really disappeared. There are internal wars, which are often, or I shouldn't say often, but sometimes terribly, terribly bloody. But it's hard to say this is human nature that's doing it. It's the institutions that we create and the way we live and the way we think. So part of what we have to do is really make people recognize this is not inevitable. It hasn't always been going on, and there are alternatives. Part of what I think needs to be done is to get more awareness of other ways of struggling, or other ways to wage conflicts. There are non-coercive ways. There are nonviolent ways, certainly, and a great deal of attention to nonviolence in recent years, and some successes. But I think we also need to expand the field, and this is where the insight comes. And one way to expand this is to see what has been the problem here. What happened with Russia? Cold War was over. We won, some people said. And I guess a couple of people said, no, we shouldn't gloat that we beat them. but we did. And there was the sense, we won. We expand NATO to the borders. And we let Russia deal with this terrible, terrible transition period. I remember I was in the Soviet Union in 1988 when it was in the process of this transformation, and it was at a human rights conference. I thought, human rights? Soviet Union, what's this? And the young Soviet people that I spoke with at the conference and elsewhere were so excited. We're going to have a country of laws. We're going to have freedom. We're going to have laws, and we're going to obey the laws. And I said, it's not simple. There was a reason that Marx wrote what he did. You liberate things, and the capitalists take over. There's there's problems. And they said, no problem. We're going to do it. And I remember going, it was in the winter, I went to Gorky Park, which is a big park in Moscow. And there were big crowds. People were speaking. And one of the speeches I still remember was, we lost 30 million people in the war. We lost more under Stalin. We must put them on trial. And, in America, we were busy doing, we were preoccupied. There were all these Eastern European countries. We had to help in their transition. But we sent over some Harvard professors who helped convince the Russians that free markets is what counted. Open up the markets. But they had only state enterprises, monopolies. And it's hard to imagine how you have free markets and monopolies, and who owns the state markets. And so a bunch of guys took over the factories and the industries, and they became the oligarchs. And to continue to live well, those who get along, go along, behave themselves, all's well. I don't know if we could have done much. It's a big country. It's got a lot of cultural traditions of its own, but we certainly didn't help. We weren't treating this as a problem, and which then became a source of shame and humiliation, to which we did not disabuse them. We won. So I think some ways of thinking about the basic notions of constructive conflict, that you take into account what the adversary is feeling and thinking, and how do you work out deals. It's important. Otherwise, this doesn't work so well. And so part of the thing is the transformation, which our emphasis has often been, is ending the oppression, ending the violence, is not enough. We have to go on to governance, to collaboration, to figure out ways in which people can work together to make that peace sustained. It was a problem, it certainly was a problem in the Middle East, and if certainly there was any thoughtfulness about how to deal with Al-Qaeda, and after all, there were Al-Qaeda with Osama bin Laden was not really so much opposed to didn't change the United States. His concern was that with the Muslim regimes, which weren't practicing what he thought, as others thought was the proper kind of Islam, and the U.S. was propping up these corrupt, bad governments, and they were trying to change their governments. They weren't succeeded, so they went to the head of the snake, who was protecting them. So the grievance wasn't against the U.S., except that the U.S. was interfering in what they thought was their place and their land. We kept, after defeating Saddam Hussein's takeover of Kuwait, we had troops in Saudi Arabia. They weren't going to stay. We were going to go out right after the Saudis, after the war was over. But they did stay. They stayed and stayed and stayed. And that was one of the chief grievances of Osama bin Laden. There are these infidels in our land. After a few years, actually, we quietly removed them. We didn't want to even say that because to admit that would be giving in to this bad. No. There are a lot of things that we need to focus on that we haven't traditionally focused on. But how do you make enduring transitions? And so part of it is just to change the way people think about these things. Part of it's in ways we know. The other thing is to expand our own knowledge about how that can be done. And that's where I think PARCC is really well situated. To think that we're going to begin to think about those transitions and how they can be sustained. There's a lot of work beginning to be done, but I don't think it's integrated fully within a larger conception of what the problem is. It's a big problem. It's a big problem, and we're just beginning, I think, to think about it. When we have to do other things within focusing on the United States, in terms of strengthening the non-military institutions. Everybody knows that in the United States, the military establishment is huge, costly, and too influential in making policy. Secretary Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense, would always refer to this idea that there were more soldiers in the military bands than there were in the State Department. State Department has always been way behind in technology. I mean, that, I don't know, Hillary ought to use that. The technology for communication within the department is rudimentary and old. It's not up to date. Never has been. It's always behind. The U.S. military, they've always got the resources. There was a lieutenant general who spoke here once, he was involved in overseeing the training of Palestinian security forces. Did you know that? It's still going on. Some of the Palestinian security forces who've been kind of vetted through the Israelis, but they work with the PA, and the training is done in Jordan. Anyway, and for a long time, it was the lieutenant general was in charge. He was designated to the State Department for this task. And I remember he said he explained the difference between working for the Pentagon and working for the State Department. Pentagon says, this is your mission, what do you need? Work State Department, they say, here's what you got, do what you can. It is incredible. And, so certainly some readjustment would be very useful. And it's hardly discussed. Every once in a while, the scandal was always that the equipment, the military equipment, costs too much, and people are making money out of it, and that should be more scandalous. I don't understand why it isn't a bigger scandal, but it's not in terms of it. It ends up that when there's a problem, you grab the hammer that's available, and that's the military. And many of the military do not want that. They say that's not what we're for. They're sent in to do things and take care of creating, doing things which really is not what they don't consider their job. Some of them are good at it, some aren't, but we're not prepared for having resources to do that. There have been some efforts at strengthening the State Department for some of these things. They have a reserve corps now, so they can call on people to send out for some of the recovery problems. But that's one thing that we could do better at. Another, I think, is using the UN. I think it's extraordinary that in this country, nobody thinks about the UN except to be criticized. So the Republican Party, for some reason, I still don't understand what it is with them. Nothing makes sense. It's a good buy. We put in money and we have tremendous influence to use a lot of resources to have peacekeepers here and there, but somehow or other, any cooperation with them would be losing our sovereignty, and the scandals are always given great play, very little attention to the effectiveness of what they do. If there had been attention to the UN, maybe we wouldn't have gone into Iraq militarily. Do you know when Powell gave his testimony? Oh, everybody said, well, Powell has spoken. We know they're weapons of mass destruction, mass destruction. There was a UN inspection going on for nuclear weapons, nuclear material, and for other weapons. They testified that they have no evidence of that. Did you know that? If the public had paid attention, say, there are these people there are doing inspections, and they say they can't find anything. And they say, actually, Saddam is cooperating. If we had paid attention to that, boom, there would not have been an invasion. So we owe a lot to the UN if we would use it better. And I think it's defamed. I think there ought to be a lot more attention to what the UN does. I think we ought to establish more peace. What I say more, I don't know if there are any peace-oriented think tanks. All the think tanks are either right-wing, neocon serving entities, or holding pens for the officials who are waiting for their party to come back into office. And so if they're doing that, they don't want to be too much at variance with their future bosses, because they want to, So even the nice think tanks are pretty mainstream, not really trying to be very innovative or very creative, because it's not practical. It's not the way we do things. As if the way we do, and this I'd have to say, with Trump, right? Saying you've been doing all this time, so what? How good has it turned out for you? Okay, all right. I do want to make sure what individuals can do, and that means you and me. And I'll sketch out some things, but I really want to spend whatever time we have left on you brainstorming about what you might do. Obviously, I'm an academic. I say you got to learn more. First off, study hard, inform yourself about specific places, but also to imagine and be creative about ways in which it could be done better. If you're an academic, you're supposed to have, and I'm a sociologist, I believe in data. You got to have an empirical grounding. So you're explaining why things happened the way they did, and obviously they happened that way, so it must have been determined that it would happen that way, so it really discourages you from thinking, well, could it have been different? And that's counterfactual thinking and speculation, and you don't get published so much for that stuff. But as a citizen, that's what you need to do. As a citizen, as historians could do it more, all of us could do it more. And then there's the conventional things that you can do, speak up, interrupt other people who are talking nonsense, write Congress, talk, give phone calls. I like calling up my members of Congress. It makes me feel better afterwards. You usually get some intern who says, yes, I'll pass this on. And no, it's a little venting, but some people think I seem to be always happy. And one reason is that I will not yield to despair. And if you don't yield to despair and you act, you don't feel so bad. Otherwise, if you're not acting about it, you can really feel miserable. And then it gets feel miserable, then you can't act, and you can't act, you feel miserable. It's a bad cycle. So speak up, join groups that are doing good work, and there are many. Search for Common Ground, which is a big NGO now, based in Washington, who does very good conflict resolution work and has been doing it for many, many years. The Near East Foundation here, and work even on the most difficult problems. Think about when we say, don't do a lot too much. I think that the peace movement say, stop, don't do that, no. And that's useful, but it's limited because people on the whole are saying, well, we got a problem. So maybe what we're doing is the only thing that we could do. And saying, no, yeah, but what's the alternative? And so we have to really have alternatives. And right now, I don't hear much real alternatives being discussed. There are really very serious problems. There's a little group here who've been studying North Korea and working with North Koreans. And they have thought of some alternatives. Well, we have. I've talked to them peripherally about. What happened in with Iran? What about doing that with North Korea? North Korea, we dismissed as a bunch of crazies. We demonized them. They're nuts. They do these crazy things, building all these nuclear weapons. What are they doing that for? They shouldn't do that. We tell them, we'll sanction them, we'll threaten them. Stop doing that. And they say, you're threatening us. What are we going to do? You're telling us we are awful and our regime should be changed? No. You stop doing that. And we say, no, you stop. And that's what we do. We've been doing that for just about always. When Bush became president, there was a period of real negotiation that was going on between North Korea and South Korea and the United States. South Korean government had the sunshine policy of relationship. The first ambassador to come to see Bush after the election was from South Korea to say, we're going to proceed with the negotiations. And Bush said, back of the hand to that. We're not doing that anymore. They declared him one of the evil nations, part of the evil empire, evil axis of evil. Powell, who was Secretary of State, wasn't even informed that this, and he reassured the Koreans, no, but we're going to continue this. But no, we didn't. It isn't as if this is baked in some cement, except by the people who've been doing it over and over, and they reassure each other that there's no alternative. There's an obvious alternative. You say, yeah, it's your country. We'll have a peace treaty. We haven't signed a peace treaty since the war in Korea. But we have to talk about it, and we'll talk about it. That's not off the table. That's on the table. We don't say that. We say, stop, and then we'll talk. And they say, you stop, and we'll talk. So, there's a lot of, all right. I keep talking. I want to stop. Go.
Hi. My name is Ruslan. I was born in Soviet Union in 1986.
Okay.
I'm from Azerbaijan. It's a post-Soviet country. My question is, do people want war? Do people want war? Like ordinary people? And besides propaganda on media, what are other factors that influence this, supposedly this desire in people to engage in war with other nations?
Well, everybody would say they don't want war. It's being forced on them. I do terrible things, not because I'm a terrible person, but because they're making me behave this way. I'm just defending myself. So part of the thing is there's fear. Nearly always on both sides, they feel that we've been victimized, that we've been taken advantage of. It's the other side that's bad. And that gets played up by leaders who often, that's their career. They have mobilized people. And it's easy sometimes to get people to support that, not because they want to make war, but they want to defend themselves against the threats that they think they're facing. And they don't know any other way of doing it because nobody is telling them, particularly in, often in authoritarian regimes where they can make it seem very convincing. But you can see that in the United States, Americans we're a good people. We are very good people. But there are people who hate us and they want to kill us. So what are we going to do? I don't know if that gets what you want.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Besides the factors that you named, what are other factors that affect in ordinary people talking a lot about war?
Well, I think there's a lot of vested interests in anything like that. Some people will make a career out of it, make money out of it. There are people who there's some people. There are other people who like the adventure. I mean, there are people, and like once something gets engaged, you like the solidarity. People are social. And once things heat up enough, you want to be with your people. And all the research shows that in World War II, the German soldiers, the American soldiers, we weren't fighting for democracy. They weren't fighting for fascism. They were fighting for their buddies in the unit that they were with. And you know, once it starts going, that's a hard thing to get people to you know, turn on their own brothers and sisters. Yes?
I just use the 2 minutes I still have before going to class. I envy the American people. They have democracy. They can say whatever they want. If I say half what you said back in Lebanon, I would be sorry?
Hanged.
No, not hanged. We can say whatever we want in Lebanon, but I would be banned from coming to the United States. I would be the American embassy would say that I am a Hezbollah supporter. If I say half of what you said, if I say it in Lebanon, I wouldn't be here in Maxwell School, benefiting from this democracy of the United States. So this is my take. There are two languages in the United States. The language of the people, of the peacemaking, and the language of some other guys. You mentioned, for example, Iran. The peace that was brokered with Iran. Well, on the other hand, if I look at the history of these past 20 years, how Americans have treated the Iranians. Well, there is one language that said that Iran is our enemy, Hezbollah is our enemy. But when America invaded Afghanistan, you have Iran got stronger. When America invaded Iraq, Iran got stronger. The second invasion of Iraq, Iran got stronger. The 2006 war in Lebanon, Hezbollah got stronger, Iran got stronger. And this takes me to what you said. You had these Muslims that were talking about the Americans leaving our Holy Land, and then nobody is talking about it right now because they have another evil, which is Iran. So the question is, another example. Secretary Kerry was brokering a deal of ceasefire in Syria with the Russians. Now, the military did not like it. They bombed somewhere and it's down the drains. Now, these two languages, how should we go about them? We love America. We love these values of democracy. We dream of having them back home. But as long as the United States has two languages, we're stuck in the middle.
Well, that's what we do. Well said. Okay, so that's what I want to do. So what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, we should have recorded it to post it on Facebook.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was an amazing time. Thank you very much.
So, yes.
My name is Bedr. I have a question about what's the probability of the peacemaking groups or conflict resolution groups such you and other people working in the field of conflict resolution that I would be honored to be one of them. So what's the probability of these independent groups or NGOs to work apart from the government to start like a people relationship, such as would the United States government ban if conflict resolution group and for an example, the North Korean example, yeah, I really appreciate that the government is sending some scholars here, but would it be possible for such groups to go to North Korean people and talk with them, or even to Iran, or even to Afghanistan, or such countries?
Afghanistan, yeah.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about such a thing that would build a trustable relationship between the both people, and for example as well, the Egyptians and Israeli or Egyptians and other countries on the borders, or Palestinians and Israeli, such that great conference that's happening, but I mean in a larger scale. So the government the government, what's the government relying on, which is the hatred that was implanted in the people's heart out of the hatred speech of the government or religious speech or some other reasons. That thing that they are relying on won't fall because the people understand that we can build such bridges. So what I'm asking about, is it possible to build like a...
Here and there it is, in some places it's not at that given time, so maybe you try to take a step back and say what would be necessary to make that possible. They have to be creative, think about how, and there are obstacles, there's no question. And I guess some of the European NGOs are freer to do things than American NGOs, because the American rules for behavior and contacting Hezbollah people or some other people are more strict. But I want to hear, so what are you going to do? Come on. Yes.
I have a question. Well,
No, not a question anymore.
it's not exactly
Okay.
but your opinion. My name is Adriana Peruvian, and this question this thought came up to my mind when you gave us this Bush example, because beyond politics or beyond the people's will, sometimes is power. And power, it doesn't matter how much it can last. It can be 1 year, 5 years, 3 months. If the person is situated in an strategic, not for its wills, but for its will, for the person's will, but in a strategic phase of the government, then it can be risky. So I'm saying this because most conflicts in Peru, some conflicts in Peru, it's better said, cannot be solved because in the middle of the development of a strategy, talking about it with the people, reframing lots of concepts, when everything is about to get done, then political will cuts things. So I was thinking on which would be your maybe best, regarding your experience, your best advice, or what do you think about trying to solve a conflict and trying to break these boundaries, and having on the other hand the intromission of the political will, because that's a problem that's been through many countries in Europe, America, and America the continent.
Yeah.
So that's sometimes because before coming here I worked at the presidency of the Council of Ministers, and in a department that worked with the structure and organization of the state, among all other functions. So when we were called to see a case and analyze how could some problem could be solved and respecting the structure and organization of the government, everything in the technical part was done really good. But then when we were about to solve things, then it went to the executive branch or maybe the advisor of the president, and things were stopped. Like, how do you reach? How do you go? Like, being creative there,
Well, I think you know better than I. And you have to think of what are the NGOs that may be able to do some things. I was in Peru once and met many of the NGOs there. And I was amazed. This is still when Fujimori was president. And they were, of course, at that point, a lot of them were getting USAID money.
Yes.
And I was a little surprised. Oh, this is my government supporting opposition to another government? But they were, and these groups were very clever and very energetic in doing local activities. Some of that continues, but it takes some ingenuity and some devotion. I've been, for a long time, we had a program here, an LDF, Leaders for Democracy Fellows, with a USAID for people from the Arab countries, young people, and they would come for a relatively short time, but how they were amazing. This was for many years before the Arab Spring, that they were working under many under very oppressive circumstances. I could just admire their courage. But presumably they were able to function for at least some of the time.
It would be very interesting if, for example, NGOs would conditionate giving more money if the country accomplished certain conditions. Because, for example, the German International Cooperation Agency group has a very, very interesting and wonderful operating programs. But they decided to cut off because Peru is willing to get into the OECD. So that is that's something that's more or less the entourage we're having, and social conflicts are not like they are still there. But it would be interesting, like, to develop some studies, case studies, to give more ideas or to give base to know what to do when everything is done and we just need like political support, like how to, because of the topics.
Catherine, are we doing any of this?
Any of the,
What?
she's in my class.
We might be.
And we're trying to get people to be creative and thinking about how to analyze and solve different conflicts.
So we're doing great job, actually.
Well, we've only had a few classes.
But I want to, yes.
This is probably not the only way, and this might depend on the country, but from what some of the things people have been saying, supporting the civil society of these countries, I think, has a big role to play in furthering the peace infrastructure. However, I'm not being someone that's been in places that has more authoritarian regimes which kind of supplant this type of initiatives. I'm not sure how you go about doing that, but I definitely think organizational power has for opposition groups, for other voice, for advocacy, has a lot of value in pushing forward people's abilities, because then it's not just mob rule, it's not just a movement that comes and goes, it's a consistent effort of voices trying to make change and negotiate with bigger powers. That's a different level than government side, I guess, but I think being innovative about those organizations and linking that with government, I think, is one way that could be useful.
Maybe we could build a public policy that may be the next new MDG policy for governments, because if they don't assure, they don't compromise to take on social conflicts as a way of developing and educating the societies, then how are they going to compromise themselves with education, health, and everything? It's like conflicts are among everywhere. That should be a public policy, certainly in the NGOs, and United Nations being behind that. And country, you want this? Okay, there you go.
I think it also depends on the political reality inside the country.
Yeah.
For instance, authoritarian states know very well how to deal with organizations, with structures, but they don't know how to deal with creative minds and chaotic groups of movements. So they're very much toolless against, let's say, intelligentsia, against unorganized youth groups that have certain agenda, that believe in certain values. It can be peace, it can be democracy or human rights. So very much depends on the political realities inside the countries. For instance, in Soviet Union knew very well, Kremlin knew very well how to deal with structures, because it was itself an authoritarian structure. Russia knows how to deal with structures, or my country, the authorities there, they know how to deal with structures, but they lack the skill in dealing with individuals who can be very powerful in what they can do in terms of spreading peace or ideas of human rights.
What happens when you have not just the authoritarian government within the country, but outside? Look at Yemen. I feel like that's a really interesting example that we haven't really touched upon. You have a group of people, a minority of the population that took control of the country 20, 30 years after a major civil war, effectively between two different countries, resulted in one country. So you've got one country that in the 80s, 90s was two for good reason, completely different cultures in the north and the south. And then they're one country for a while. And then you have a group in the far north, in the border with Saudi Arabia, rise to power and take over the capital. And then as their influence begins to spread throughout the country, you have Saudi Arabia and Iran to an extent pushing in, influencing things. So it's not just, you've got so many different actors at play there, so many different externalities and internalities, so many displaced entities, so much inability to come together in a way to try to challenge conflict, to try to resolve the conflict, because there's almost too many interests at play from all different actors for the people who are suffering, for like the guys I used to buy strawberry juice from to be able to feed their families. How do you resolve a situation like that?
Yeah, or you could go to the United States Embassy, and there's actually a joke in my country that all the politicians, before running for elections, they go and meet with the US ambassador and other European ambassadors. So when you go and meet with them, the way they talk to you is always so optimistic and so inspirational that they really encourage you, to continue, with your activities. Of course, you're not doing this because US ambassador is encouraging you, but still, this is encouragement, this is inspiration. Yeah. But once you get arrested, or once your organization gets shut down, or there's a freeze on your bank account, then that inspiration and that encouragement, especially now, is not always helping you, because it's not because they don't want to, it's just because the international environment is designed in a way that states cannot really directly help certain civil society organizations in terms of protecting their security. Yeah, I was personally helped by them, yes. But my other 8 friends that got arrested, one of them is still in jail. So it's the risks, as you said, internal and externally, and your ties with external power definitely affects your activities inside the country. You may be portrayed as a US spy, you may be portrayed as somebody working for Mossad, and other kind of labels can be put on you.
Right, and the LDF people who came here, remember the very first program, half the program was spent talking about why is the United States funding this program? Because they were all at risk for coming here, because their concern was they'd be seen as agents of the CIA. So you're right. I mean, that's a real good point. Association with the United States is no. But the Yemen strikes me as Lou's point about the United Nations. That if we had a United Nations that was functional, these proxy wars, Saudi Arabia basically killing thousands of people in Yemen, etc. If we had a stronger United Nations, those sorts of things just shouldn't happen.
What could the United Nations specifically do to stop someone from doing that? I mean, because there are multiple actors. I think you're kind of saying secular actors that are coming in, not just all state actors.
Well, but there are enough state actors in that one. I mean, if you took Saudi Arabia out of it,
well, and Iran.
And Iran?
Yeah.
I mean, these proxy wars are the sorts of things that the United Nations was supposed to help with.
That is incredible. It's incredible. Credibility in such countries like this.
Yemen was the poorest country in the world for many reasons. Now they don't have any buildings. Now every single hospital has been destroyed at least once.
Well, on the one hand, we have this interest of solving conflicts, but on the other hand, we have the own United States interest. Because I remember, as an experience, I don't remember under which government we were in Peru, but the United States offered to build up a whole military base in the middle of the jungle if Peru just would allow them to install another, as huge as the one they were going to build, another base for controlling South America and Latin America, and maybe more than that, because Peru, it's like in the central part of South America, more or less. It could be in the middle. So it was a strategic word for them. It was President Toledo. And if the United States would build this base here in the center, they would control a lot of things from there. And they would what Peru would gain would be it could have been like to get help with the terrorism. So President Toledo said no way. But that's
Yeah. Because if America behaved better, then maybe our reputation wouldn't be so stigmatizing. But I think we could. I think that this conversation we're having a good conversation. Maybe that will continue, and I hope it does. The opportunity that exists here with people from all over the world is just wonderful. And trade stories, and trade support, and help each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.